One of the themes that was in that meeting was military doctrine. The delegation was a very high-powered one. The senior officer was a Colonel General Yakovlev, Commander-in-Chief, former Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Rocket Forces, now Commandant of the General Staff Academy. His deputy was the Deputy Commandant, General Lieutenant Derbin, and then a host of major generals and colonels all sent to talk with NATO, the Defense College there, prior to the Lisbon Summit. So the idea was this was a sort of test run for what was going to happen at Lisbon and how the militaries, as opposed to civilians, were going to interact. Well, to make a long story short, it was a reasonably good meeting. There was some reasonably frank exchanges, and doctrine was one of the areas that was debated and discussed. This is not an account of what I did last week. It is an account of the paper that I did a long time ago and how it fit in to that event. I was asked by the Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute to look at Russian military doctrine in the fall of 2009 because we were told there was going to be a new military doctrine before January. So I dutifully joined the conference. It happened in January and there was no new military doctrine yet. So you go, well, you can make a comment about a paper that's not been issued yet on the basis of the leaks, which is, you can do that in Washington. This is what it's going to look like, and it's in or it's not out, these various things. And I, being a historian, said, yeah, I can do some of that, but what I'd really rather do is make sure my audience, which is a Western security community, civilian experts, military, understood what military doctrine is inside the Russian and Soviet experience, so that when they came to look at it, they would have some sense of where it fit into a larger corpus of information. And to that end, I can tell you that on February 5th, a month after our meeting, President Medved issued a new military doctrine. Okay. And within less than a week, the Secretary General of NATO said it was not a helpful document because it pictured NATO as a problem. Well, it was very interesting because I had just written a paper for Eurasian Daily Monitor in which I had said, Jesus, this is really pretty good because they haven't named NATO as a threat. So you have different people have different expectations. They said there were some things that were problems as dangers, but they didn't list the alliance of the United States as threats. So, good news. And, more importantly, throughout the fall, the big issue that everybody had been discussing was whether they would put into it the concept of nuclear first strike to deal with a conventional attack that threatened the territorial integrity or sovereignty of Russia, with the notion that they could preempt that. And that had been talked about by Nikolai Patrushev, the head of the Security Council, which was entrusted with putting the document together, and it had been bullied and promoted by General Baluyevsky, who was the former chief of the General Staff and now the senior military spokesman on the Security Council. When it didn't appear, hey, we made out pretty well because that was an absolute no-starter. If they had gone there, the whole range of having possible further discussions on nuclear stuff, the relationship between theater and strategic nuclear systems would have all been problematic. Didn't happen, so good news on that side. NATO, however, responded as, whoa, no, this really doesn't reflect where NATO-Russian relations should be. Well, where should NATO-Russian relations be? If you are looking at 2008, And the Russo-Georgian War and the response to it, you could probably say this thing could have certainly been much more confrontational. Because there was a period in the immediate aftermath of that war when people were talking about a new Cold War. There were folks in the United States saying we are all Georgians. There was $1 billion investment in Georgian security. And Georgia was seen as an acid test of whether Russia was a partner that you could play with. Interesting comment. A new administration came in. It proclaimed something called reset. And there were all sorts of signals sent out by this administration, most particularly on strategic arms talks, and certainly most directly on how it wanted to relate to Russia in NATO, so that reset was extended from U.S.-Russian relations into NATO-Russian relations. And indeed, the summit, which we just had over the weekend, was the first official manifestation of that quote-unquote new relationship. So, how did we go from what looked like intensifying conflict in 2008 to reset and increasing talk of a deepened NATO-Russian partnership, and dare I say to you, serious discussion about NATO enlargement that now includes Mother Russia? I don't think it happened, but it's at least thrown out by some of the NATO members as a possibility. How did that transformation take place, and how does Russian military doctrine fit into it? Well, to understand that, we've got to understand what military doctrine is supposed to mean. I use here the official Soviet definition. That's Marshal Grechko back in the 1970s. You find it in the military encyclopedia. It says, here's what it is. It's an official view on a whole set of questions about preparation and conduct of war. It is, in the Russian concept, the Summa Theologica. Everything about national security in the Soviet state was subsumed under military doctrine. Well, did they have a document that really said that? No. They had a declared need to have such a document, and we'll talk about where that came from, and who are the lobbyists for declared military doctrine. And then we'll talk about Soviet practice, which was to say, we have one, but it's not necessarily out there in full detail, and we'll only show you bits and pieces of it as we deem necessary, given the nature of the international situation and community. In the Soviet case, ideological assumptions were the foundation of all doctrinal writings. And that was, quote unquote, the nature of the Soviet system, the guiding role of the Communist Party, the nature of the threat in the outside environment, and the party's assessment of whether contradictions in the international climate made war fatally inevitable or not fatally inevitable. And Uncle Joe gave us a famous statement in 1952 at the 19th Party Congress, conference that said, no, it's no longer fatally inevitable. So you can thank Uncle Joe that we aren't necessarily have to blow each other off the face of the earth. The point here is doctrine as a phenomenon, military doctrine as a requirement, did not start in the Soviet period. If you look for where a call for military doctrine arose, it was after the Russo-Japanese War. And it emerged because, within the General Staff, Imperial General Staff, because they had a notion that their conception of war preceding their defeat was inadequate to deal with the phenomenon that they saw in the war, and particularly on the battlefield. They said they were unprepared for modern war. So the idea of modern war and military doctrine are like this. Now, the answer to the reformers who were calling for this before World War I was Nicholas II, who simply says, I define all military doctrine. I'm the autocrat. That's the way it's done. That did not necessarily make a whole bunch of military reformers very happy. It did not endear the dynasty to those who were particularly concerned about the initial period of war, the conduct of operations, etc. But that was the position, if you will, when Russia went to war and the imperial system collapsed. What I would point out to you that is immediately after the collapse of the imperial system, the military specialists who are now in the Soviet army, these are Tsarist officers who served in the general staff, come back out and in the first publications like Voyenная Delo say, we got to have a military doctrine. This state has to have a notion of what its environment is, what it sees as threats, how it organizes its military, and it's got to have that guidance. That didn't go very far, because that was a technical military argument for it. But echoes of it were picked up by party elite, most specifically some commanders who emerged as effective during the Civil War, the most important being Mikhail Frunze. And it was Frunze who came up with the idea that what the Soviet state needed in the 1920s was a unified military doctrine that would pull everything together. The origins of this are very much associated with the debate and discussion inside the main staff of the Red Army, inside the Combined Arms Academy of the Red Army, about strategy and about national leadership. The dominant concept that emerged in that era was a modern state facing modern war had to have an integral commander who was civilian and understood the politics of war, why a state would go to war, what political objectives were, how politics would be practiced internationally and domestically, a military leadership skill in the conduct of war and understanding the relationship between political objective and military means, and an economic leadership. Find your way around. Come on, grab one over here. And an economic leadership that would find itself essentially capable of mobilizing the state for war. That was what Frunze meant by unified military doctrine. And it became a gospel. And it was a subject of very sharp debate from the middle 1920s down to the early 1930s. Now, what happened to that debate? It disappeared like every other debate did in military affairs under Joe Stalin. Because Joe Stalin didn't like to have public debates. Joe Stalin liked the idea that the leadership would formulate policy to have guidance and not have to worry about various clientage creating demands and conditions. Those military leaders who were particularly interested in radical change discovered in the middle 1930s that Uncle Joe was not averse to taking actions against them as he was against political leaders. And so you have doctrine left over as a concept, but there's no place for an intellectual debate about doctrine. There is rather what I will call an ideological set of suppositions that are presented to the Russian public. And there is a big debate whether those assumptions were in fact how the Soviet state prepared for war, or whether they were in fact a form of political agitation which concealed far greater and far deeper concerns. What was this posture? The Red Army would, with collectivization, industrialization, and mechanization, become a military force that if the Soviet Union was attacked, would immediately carry war into the opposing state's land. The war would be rapid, it would be decisive, the Soviet Union would win, and it would carry the revolution forward with it. That's Clem Voroshilov, it's the notion of bloodless war. And you will find it in treaties, statements, all throughout the 1930s. Did Uncle Joe believe that? These statements were made, and I want to point out they're historically conditioned. They began in the late 1920s with the industrialization movement, and they continue into the mid-1930s and later. When they are originally made, when you're talking about war plans that the USSR thinks it's going to have to fight, there are two war plans that matter. These are secret, but this is what the state was thinking it was fighting. There was one called P, and the other was called R. Can you figure out what P and R refer to? Poland and Romania. Deep code here. Okay. And the issue, the question was, big debate issue, would in fact Poland and Romania get assistance from the French, whom they were allied with, through the Leavenworth, and more importantly from the British, who had the naval power to intervene on the periphery of Imperial Russia. That posture continues to be stated when new threats appear. In 1931, the Japanese invade Manchuria. There's a real rush to rearm in the Far East. There's never any discussion in the Far East about a quick, decisive war. The notion is general, and the conflicts that are in fact fought in 1938 and 1939 are in no way decisive revolutionary fights. There's a nasty one in 1938 at Lake Hassan, and it's about restoring a border. When the Red Army essentially gets the Japanese to recognize the border they want, the fighting ends. In the case of Halkidiki, a year later, where there's a war over the border between Manchukuo and Mongolia, Zhukov is specifically instructed by Stalin he may carry out an operation to annihilate the Japanese corps, but he may not cross what the Soviets say is the legitimate border between Manchukuo and Mongolia. That's not spreading the world revolution. That's a much more circumspect use of military force. In Europe, please note, a new threat emerges between 1933 and 1935. In this particular case, it is Germany, and the doctrinal publication on that is a joint article, well, it's on one author, Tukhachevsky writes it for Bolshevik, but we know who edited it, because we've got his copy. And Joe Stalin edited it. And here was the statement, the official statement by the Soviet state, that Germany was emerging as a threat. The Stalin editing suggests that it was a threat, but it did not necessarily mean a fatal confrontation. Soviet policy after that talks about popular front from below. It talks about organizing alliances to check German influence, the Czech-Soviet, Czech-French being an example of that. But there's never any change in the notion that if war came, it would in fact be decisive and quick victory. 1939, 1940, if you watch what Joe Stalin does, he maneuvers to stay out of a war. He may invade countries, but he does it either after they have collapsed or after he's already overcome the political leadership in the case of the Baltic states, or in the case of Finland when he essentially believes they are totally isolated and indefensible. But you end up with Uncle Joe having a problem, because his assumption was there would be a war in Europe that essentially would be a stalemate. The Anglo-French would fight themselves out, and the Soviet Union would stand back and either politically or militarily intervene to its advantage. In 1940, that collapsed with the German victory in France, and a year later, Uncle Joe finds himself in a war which he certainly did not want at that time, and certainly the USSR was not prepared to fight, and all the notions about speedy victory and overcome were swept aside by a simple declaration by Stalin. We were surprised. The Germans were perfidious. Well, that really is not a good doctrinal premise, and between June 1941 and Stalin's death, we are going to have an explanation of what happened in 1941 that takes responsibility off the Soviet leadership and says, look at our remarkable recovery. Look at how the nation came together, look at how we fight, look at how we won, and use that to legitimize the Soviet state. But there is no discussion, any serious discussion, of military lessons learned. They're allowed to be summed up in 5 permanent operating factors, and the military is told, be satisfied with that. Now, this is a time when a war ends. The Soviet Union inherits an empire in Eastern Europe. It goes into confrontation with the United States, and we have the appearance of nuclear weapons. In terms of debate and discussion about doctrine, we have no effective voice throughout that entire period. That is not to say there aren't people in the General Staff who are concerned about what nuclear weapons might mean. There are clearly questions of how the economy should be organized. There's lessons of how the Army might be modernized and mechanized on the basis of the experience from World War II. But the supreme leadership is essentially saying, these will all be handled by us, and they will not be allowed to enter into the public debate. All the public has to know is, 1946, Joe says it, capitalism is still nasty. The Western Allies are bent upon doing nasty things to the Soviet Union, and therefore there is a rising risk of war. Which continues to rise, by the way, until 1952, and he says, well, the war is not fatally inevitable. It is only after Uncle Joe's death that doctrine is allowed to reemerge. And it reemerges in a debate over where the Soviet military should go. Now, the context of this is, of course, the emerging Cold War. The military and industrial commitment to mass industrial war. That is, the entire Soviet economy still being organized around a conscript army to generate millions and millions of men, and mechanized forces which represent Soviet stability in Eastern Europe, and short of war with NATO developed the instrument to carry that forward. In the context of a nuclear revolution, the difference is 1953, when not only does Joe Stalin die, but both the Soviet Union and the United States deploy thermonuclear weapons. Thermonuclear weapons are a geographic increase in explosive power. You go from kilotons to megatons. And you go with a possibility now of a transformation in the way in which those weapons might be employed in warfighting. In the Russian case, it comes out of a general staff that's run by artillerists, and they look out the systems to do strike. They get enamored with ballistic missiles, and there's good reasons for that given where they are and the limitations of air power. And they begin to discuss what is a military technical revolution. The revolution is the ballistic missile, advanced computational power for guidance and control, and thermonuclear weapons. Khrushchev offers that as a means which will in fact reduce Soviet defense costs. He is particularly concerned in the late 1950s with a demographic crisis. Think about who's coming of age in 1959. The cohort born between 1931, from 1931 till 1945 is going to be thin pickings because of Uncle Joe's collectivization, then the mass terror, and then the war. And he's looking for some way to get out of the intensive manpower business. with a notion of a military doctrine that will emphasize nuclear warfighting. It is Khrushchev who says we're going to produce ballistic missiles like sausages. We get, at this point, under Khrushchev's guidance, the publication by the General Staff of Military Strategy, Военная стратегия, by Sokolovsky, who's the former chief of the General Staff. The authors of it are, in fact, all professors and members of the General Staff who do the individual chapters, and it's about nuclear warfighting. It goes through 3 very quick editions. There's one in 1962, there's one in 1963, and there's one in 1968. All of them ramifications of changes in what the Soviets perceive as the likely course and outcome of nuclear exchange. The context is one where the Soviet Union, in fact, has no parity in these systems, in spite of what Khrushchev has said, and where, in crisis, the Soviet Union is, in fact, forced to back down. The end result of that, along with economic mismanagement, was the removal of Mr. Khrushchev. And the emergence of the Brezhnev leadership, which clearly saw nuclear parity as the manifestation of Soviet security, and the long-term establishment of it as the superpower partner of the United States. They're ideologically hostile, but they are both in condition to run their blocks. And that's clearly what the Soviet leadership saw as the appropriate model for how the world would work. Brezhnev's period divides into 2 reasonable parts. The first is the one getting parity. And that's recognized by Richard Nixon in the early 1970s with treaties, the first SALT Treaty and the ABM Treaty. And it is de facto a recognition on our side of what you call mutual assured destruction. There is no nuclear war fighting technique that's going to give you victory, given the size and extension of the arsenals. You will note that in the later Soviet period, particularly in Brezhnev, from about 76 on, for the next 5 years, there is a decline in the Soviet leadership. It tends to age and ossify. And its conceptions of how the world is working become more and more concerned with instability in the bloc itself. There are more challenges to the existing order. There are more problems emerging. And so you get a fixation on holding on to things, particularly as the intensity of the rivalry with China emerges. In the 1950s, you have a Sino-Soviet relationship, which was absolutely perfect. The Chinese carry the security burden in the Far East. They're in absolute antagonism with Washington after the Korean War. And the USSR can effectively say a minimal presence in the Far East because, 1, we don't want to defend, and 2, the Chinese will pick up the banner. By the end of Khrushchev's tenure as party secretary, we have ideological conflict openly with China. We have the Soviets considering preemptive moves as China's getting closer to building a bomb. And by 1969, we have open fighting between the Chinese and the Soviets on the Ussuri River. Small-scale stuff, but nonetheless clearly a relationship of antagonism. In doctrinal terms, the Soviets never make a statement about what that means. They posture to deal with China, but the notion of what it would mean to have a split among the socialist camp, despite the fact they've already had one with Yugoslavia, they do not specifically address. They build military capabilities. They are fearful of China joining a Western camp in some sort of true and effective containment. But for all intents and purposes, they do not offer a public posture which links the emerging American threat and the Chinese. By the late 1970s, Marshal Agarkov is, in fact, getting doctrine back into the discussion. And he gets it back in by suggesting that the military technical revolution has run its course, and that there is another revolution, a revolution of military affairs, which affects conventional systems, which is emerging. And he associates this with automated troop control, he associates it with precision strike systems, he associates it with, if you will, an information revolution in military affairs. Presenting this to the Soviet leadership in the early 1980s, when you've got leaders dying one after another in rapid succession, and an economic crisis because the system cannot generate resources, you end up with effectively the leadership saying, thank you very much, we don't want to hear about this. At the same time, the United States is proclaiming another revolution, which is associated with defensive, strategic defensive systems, which is going to make Soviet strategic nuclear parity obsolescent. That's the Star Wars. There is a huge debate in the USSR in the middle 1980s about this phenomenon. And it takes place in the context of a fairly sharp look at the world, which says, are the Americans going to attack or not? There's some misunderstanding about an Able Archer exercise in Europe. There's taking Reagan pronouncements as intent. There's the nasty business of KAL 007. And you have a fight essentially between KGB, external service, which is saying there's no evidence of heightened war tension, and the GRU, which says, oh no, there is in fact rising tension, and the Americans may be moving towards preemption. Ronald Reagan actually diffuses that when he announces Star Wars. And this is usually what's supposed to have broken the Soviet system. It did not. Because what it did was it fundamentally allowed the KGB to end the debate about war imminent. How did they do it? They looked at Star Wars, they looked at the technology that have to be invested in, the long-term payoff over decades, and said, if you're going to war, you don't invest there. The debate that followed that, and it's very important for the last phase of the Soviet Union, is, well, what the hell are the Americans doing then? And a fellow by the name of Andrei Cushing, who was the leading Soviet expert, wrote a pugwash paper. And it was about strategic lift. And what he did was take what we said about the shuttles and what we said about our Atlas Centaur program, which were the lift systems, we had things to put into space, and then said, now here's what they said when they were deploying the systems, and here is what's happening now in terms of turnaround between flights. We said every 3 months, it turned out to be a year. And they were only carrying about 1/3 of the load. Cushing did his numbers and said, if you're talking about deploying, the shuttle is not going to be adequate to anything in any short order to get into space. And then he looked at Atlas Centaur and said, this is an obsolescent system, and guess what? They have nothing on the books to replace it. He concluded out of that, the Americans were not going to deploy massive, large-scale space-based assets. What he said was, the Americans are going into space, but they're going into space for something else. And his conclusion was they were going into space to use it for reconnaissance, for precision strike, for geospatial orientation. That is to say, they were going into it for what Agarkov had said was the revolution in military affairs. So when you hear that Star Wars won the Cold War, it diffused the Cold War. It looked like it was going hot. But the real impact on the Russians was, in fact, the clear conventional capabilities that we were acquiring. And they began in 1987, 88 to talk about reconnaissance strike and reconnaissance fire complexes, which would be able to maneuver through an opposing conventional force at depth and destroy assets that you would have had to maneuver to destroy in the past. The outcome of that was a new discussion on military doctrine by reformers who were in and outside the General Staff. The most important voice inside the General Staff was Vladimir Lobov, who became the last Soviet head of the General Staff and was a deputy to Akrameyev when Akrameyev was chief of the General Staff. The second voice was Valentin Larionov, who, guess what, was one of the original authors of Sokolovsky. And the last fellow was a fellow by the name of Andrei Kukushin, who was Larionov's graduate student at the Institute of USA in Canada. So you had the General Staff, ISKCON, and Larionov through the Academy of General Staff, brought together as a critical voice now saying there should be a new military doctrine based on defense sufficiency. And the bottom line on that one was get rid of the metal eaters, get rid of the mass armor and that crap, and make the jump to an information society. Because that's the only way we will, in fact, be capable of dealing militarily with the world outside. So you get doctrine brought in here as part of perestroika, and at a time when the Russian military is, in fact, looking at the world and saying, oh, and by the way, we're now under attack at home because of Glasnost. The debate and discussion about sufficient defense brings doctrine back into political discourse at a time when the Soviet Union is collapsing and, if you will, its military disappears. As soon as the Soviet military disappears and the Soviet Union disappears, the survivals of the military inside Russia immediately start saying, if we're going to have a Russian national military, what's the first thing we need? A military doctrine. How in God's name? Who's going to write it? Well, let me make 2 points to you. Boris Yeltsin did not trust the military after the coup of August 1991. He did trust a conspirator who would change sides. He made him Minister of Defense. But there's no written military doctrine until when? November 2nd, 1993. Why do you think that date is significant to get the military doctrine for the Russian Federation? What happened in October? We had a small, nasty bit between the Supreme Soviet and the presidential government. We tried to lock the parliament members outside. That failed. They held the building. Yeltsin decided he was going to clear it. They tried to seize the communication station out of Stankino. We had chaos in the streets and then firing on the White House. Gratchov's boys delivered. They got the tanks, 5 of them, Kazimiersky Division, came down and bombarded the White House, and whatever was there collapsed. And as a result of that, the president approved Gratchov's military doctrine. Nobody else's. It was his. There was no large consultation. The General Staff wasn't brought in. This was his document, made up essentially in conferences held between him and leading parts of the military establishment. It was a document which said the near abroad matters. We have no threats outside. And the Russian military is essentially going to be restructured to reflect what are essentially airborne forces. Because, as the Chief of the General Staff told me back in these years, General Gratchov is a very good airborne commander. He is also a graduate of our institution, but he is not a gold medalist. In the General Staff, that's like saying he's one of the slower swimmers, okay? So we got a first military doctrine in 1993, which has no threat, which talks about the near abroad, need to intervene there, which is shaped by at least the political juncture of we're going to have some kind of partnership with the West, and one that clearly expresses what the Ministry of Defense wants. Now, two things. Boris Yeltsin gave it to the military, but then he cut the funding. He, in fact, pushed real money after 1993, not in to MOD, but into the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Why? He trusted them. Because unlike certain people who didn't show up at the right time, the head of the internal troops fought the battle. His boys fought the Battle of Stankino and won it, and they were always loyal. And so under Boris Yeltsin, although you have this military doctrine, which MOD wrote, in fact the investment and direction is towards internal forces, and Boris Yeltsin is increasingly looking at not external intervention, but internal intervention. 94, he's preparing to go in and solve things in Chechnya, which he doesn't exactly solve, and which leads to some fairly bad problems. External world, please note that between 1993 and 1999, the Russians still proclaim they got no enemies, they got love and kisses, the environment's fine. 1999, we have a nasty little confrontation over Kosovo. We had been cooperating with them in Bosnia, Russian troops under American leadership inside the division. Once the West, through NATO, says we're going to act unilaterally in Kosovo, we don't give a damn about you, you end up with the Russians going their own ballistic, and you suddenly have the emergence of a new national security team. One made up of a former external service KGB operative who proved himself to be a good entrepreneur and official in St. Petersburg, who's brought to Moscow to work inside the Kremlin apparatus, and quickly goes to be head of the FSB and then head of the Security Council. And we get a second military doctrine written in 2000 in which NATO is the problem. NATO expansion, NATO deployments, NATO ignoring of Russian interests, and most importantly of all, NATO as an instrument of U.S. global hegemony. So we got a doctrine in 2000. It is Putin's doctrine. He goes from head of the Security Council to prime minister, to appointed president, to elected president. He puts his best buddy, Sergei Ivanov, in as head of the Security Council. We get a new doctrine, and by God, it looks like everything's coming together because this one, the Security Council does a national security concept, they do a foreign policy concept, and they got a military concept. They're all fit together, and everything is hunky-dory. Now, maybe anti-Western, but at least it made a coherent whole. Security Council's become a better institution. Mid-1990s, it's a battleground between Leavenworth and Yeltsin loyalists. That ends in 1996, transformed into a working institution. Putin seems to say, this matters, it's going to work. 2001, suddenly Ivanov is pushed off into the Ministry of Defense, and the Security Council is handed over to a guy who's Shoigu, who is Minister of Internal Affairs. And after he hurts himself, he stays chief, but he hurts himself in an accident in Sakhalin, they replace him with someone from the Foreign Ministry. Trust me, these are not real players in the power ministries in Moscow. And the Security Council declines as an institution in importance. Ivanov actually writes a new military doctrine, just didn't call that, in 2004. He has a fight with the General Staff over it. And you're looking at it and going, well, there is absolutely no order or anything else. The whole concept of military doctrine, who's it belong to? We don't know. General Staff? Cushing sort of said, yeah, it's ours. He said everything was theirs. The Security Council, not under weak leadership. Minister of Defense. The Minister of Defense suddenly is pulled out. And Mr. Putin, one of his last acts as president, says, well, what I'm going to do is get rid of Ivanov and bring in a fellow by the name of Svechin, whose credentials for defense are that he ran financial accounts in the Ministry of Finance, tax collection, and before that he was a furniture factory manager. What's going on here? Well, the answer probably was he wanted to cut down on corruption inside the Ministry of Defense. At the same time, as he's ending his term of president, he now gets his appointed successor in Medvedev, and we have suddenly the transformation of a whole bunch of institutions. Suddenly the Security Council was languishing, gets a new head. Who? Nikolai Patrushev. Where did he come from? Former head of the FSB. This is a power player. This is the guy who's got some assets. To back him up, we've removed the chief of the General Staff because he'd gotten too old, and we move him over as the chief military advisor to the new Security Council. The Security Council sits down, they write the national security concept, they push through a foreign ministry, a foreign policy concept, and in 2009 they tell us they're going to give us a national security document. Largely written, and it's originally being talked about in the aftermath of Georgia. It has that smell to it. But between then, the political leverage shifts, and guess what? Our friends, the fellows in Medvedev's team, suddenly recast the direction and content of it. They recast it to be a document that reflects the reset. This one is a fascinating exercise. There are no military uniforms present when this baby is signed. Chief of the General Staff is not only not there, he doesn't comment on it. Svechin is there, but he doesn't make any big spaces. This is essentially a presidential document. It reflects a presidential initiative for a new security architecture in Europe, which nobody in the West was taking particularly seriously. It doesn't name anybody as an opponent. It talks about problems with NATO. This is the description of what it says the international environment is. I'll read it pretty quickly. Globalization, okay, we got to deal with that. We got to deal with hegemony, okay. But none named. Not NATO, not US. What they end up saying is, we got these problems. Infrastructure. Move NATO infrastructure forward. Okay, we'll accept the fact that you put Estonia in. But we don't want NATO aircraft regularly basing out of there on our border. We don't want the infrastructure to be active to reinforce forward deployment. Georgia and Ukraine, absolute, it's there, but the Russians understand it's not active. We didn't get Georgia's admission at Bucharest in 2008. That's probably why the Georgians did what they did. Figuring it was the last gasp to make their own deal. We say we're for territorial integrity of Georgia, but nobody's going to do anything about it. So the Russians look at that one and say, not a problem. And Ukraine, they've got their government, Ukraine. Now, it may not be their government. It may, in fact, be much more willing to be follow its own line, but it's certainly not one that's going to push immediate NATO membership as the solution to Ukraine's problems. They did oppose the deployment, and how did we do that? We sidestepped it. We effectively told the Czechs and Poles, oops, we really don't want to do that. We're not going to find another answer. And what is our answer? Naval systems based offshore. You still have a sensors problem, and there's talk about where you might put sensors, how the Russians might play in it, but it basically takes it out of the game of deployment of hard systems in Eastern Europe. Violating existing arms treaties by some states. What this effectively means is one CFE, they say the CFE system doesn't work because things get included against us because it was made with the Soviet Union, and quite frankly, it's not balanced. We have other states acquiring military potential on the flanks, for instance, read Caucasian states, and they're not necessarily part of anything that adds to Russia's security. And of course, they have the unilateral action, which is perfectly legal, but one they didn't like, of the abrogation of the ABM treaty. They weren't happy about that, but it was within our right. But they say, okay, if you're going to tear up treaties and arrangements, that's a major problem. Where is their Rue Allen? What do we have? We have common interests in anti-terrorism, anti-narcotics trafficking, and against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Okay. Are there other areas of possible cooperation? Well, clearly one that NATO is most interested in is supply and infrastructure to support operations in Afghanistan. And if we're going to be there till 2014, you may assume that NATO is going to be most interested in the Russians being cooperative. We talk about what we haven't gotten. Well, some NATO members have. Both the Germans and the French can move combat systems on the Russian rail system, but it's their individual national agreements, not NATO agreements. Russia fears the two-tiered NATO. They think they have pretty good relations with the old tier. Read Berlin and Paris. They are very much afraid that, given NATO's consensus nature, the East Europeans are going to prevent any kind of normalization. Although if you look at relations between Russia and Poland right now, you probably suggest that they finessed that one. It's the Baltic states that are particularly the largest problem. And they backed themselves in the shins in 2007 when they managed to take a crisis over what was residue of the Great Patriotic War and turn it into national confrontation with Estonia, including some covert, whether run by the state or not is unclear, but covert actions against not just the Estonian state, but particularly the Estonian economy. Because Estonia has made itself into a important player in international systems, technology, IT, and clearly it was a way of discrediting Estonia as a place to do business. Their largest fear, and it came out in Rome, was that the reset is going to go away. They looked at the vote, not getting a vote on the treaty. They do not expect it to be ratified. And if there is not a ratification of that, what can Obama deliver on the rest of reset? And so, while there is a good climate right now, don't count on it surviving if, in fact, we get into more confrontations. The military doctrine says absolutely nothing about the Far East. Not pro, not anti. The Russians will occasionally talk about security in Central Asia, and they'll emphasize the Collective Security Treaty Organization. But they will not talk about, now, Shanghai as that is an instrument. Okay, questions? I've done my bit.
I have two very quick.
Two quick, okay.
Did you discuss the concept of what constitutes threat or attack? this is physical, and in that connection, there is an alarming thing in the new doctrine that crept its way in of preemptive nuclear strike.
No, it did not. It did not. It's not there.
Was taken out?
Yeah, it's not there. That was one of the things we were most looking for. If that was there, we assumed that Georgia had the Georgia conflict was still present, and that what they were. That was primarily aimed to say, don't try to intervene if we're intervening. No, that's not there. Now, there were two separate statements. There was the military doctrine, and then there was a nuclear posture statement. The nuclear posture statement was classified. There were leaks about it, which said, don't worry, but it's a classified document. I can't tell you exactly what that says. But I can tell you this, if I was looking where they were going to use nuclear weapons, it is not in the European theater. Their primary problem is the Far East. They just did a major military exercise called Vostok 2010 last summer. And if you look at, they had what they talked about a hypothetical opponent. In one case, it could have been the Japanese on a small landing up at the Kuril Islands. In one case, there was a naval exercise which involved anti-carrier operations. It was probably us. Everything else, and that was the largest part of the operation, the only people they could possibly fight were the Chinese. And it ranged from the Vladivostok area to Blagoveshchensk all the way across to Chita. And they had an operation where they had 2 brigades engaged, and it ended with a simulated nuclear strike. As I pointed out in an essay I did last year, the head of the Siberian military district says, we've got enough to confront the Chinese, but if that's used up, then we go nuclear. And he laid out an order of battle in which it's Russian 2 brigades against the equivalent of 2 full Chinese combined armed armies. I don't know about you, but that looks like Custer and the Indians. But they don't talk about it. They're absolutely silent about it. There are some military critics, Alexander Svechin, who have said this is the real problem we have. And we are essentially whistling through the graveyard because everybody's afraid to talk about it publicly because they don't want a confrontation with China. And they're scared to death over something happening in Korea which would lead to an East-West Chinese, U.S.-Japanese confrontation where they would be pulled in. And there's no question which side they have to be on. I don't think they want to be there. I think they would much rather have the Korean things resolved peacefully. I mean, they did a beautiful, they sent an investigative team out to look at the evidence on the sinking of the Chohan,
That's a good question.
frigate, North South Korea frigate. They did the investigation, and then they kept postponing the report. There were leaks that it was, well, the Americans are exaggerating, and there were other leaks that no conclusion has been drawn, and they basically didn't say anything until the UN voted, and it was pushed aside because they didn't want to be pushed into taking sides. They have an unbelievably weak hand in the Far East. They know it, and they don't want to be put in a situation where they're going to have to deal with it by open conflict.
Jacob, so what side? You said it's obvious.
Oh, they're going to go Chinese. There's not a single damn about it. I once had a very interesting discussion with General Reagan about NATO and Russian membership. And he looked at me and he said, "You'll never let us in." And I said, he said, "Because you're never going to guarantee our Far Eastern borders. We don't have any, I mean, they would be effectively in a situation Stalin was in 1939. The British and French are offering help. Right. How are they going to get here? What are they going to do? They can't do a damn thing for Poland. What are they going to do for us? In the Far East, there is no American game to play. There's no American resources. that can protect the maritime provinces, or Chita, or Siberia.
What about nukes?
Oh, you mean we'd extend the nuclear?
Why not?
We would extend our nuclear protection to. I'd love to see that. I'd love to see that debated in the United States. American businesses are going to use nukes against China to destroy their infrastructure, the things they've invested in, to protect Russian interests in the Far East. Could be. I wouldn't count on it.
When you say on the Chinese side, do you mean that the strict neutrality don't want to get, because in a sense that would be taking side, but they would be saying that why would they actually come out
because the Chinese would look at them very nicely and say, we want to make sure there are certain deliveries that continue. We're going to war, therefore we expect certain resources which you now divide in various and sundry ways, there'll be more going to China. And you want good relations with us, don't you? Because there are 9 million Russians in the Far East. Not all Russians, okay? 60% of all the products sold in the Far East now, by Russian admission, are Chinese. Who the hell's going to feed the region? If the Chinese get rough, the Japanese just got a lesson the Chinese getting rough over light metals, didn't they? And suddenly, well, you want to muck with one of our fishing vessels? Well, we'll just cut off your supply. And what does that do to your electronics industry? China can play rough. And the Russians are sitting out there with a very bad hand. I mean, I looked at the fact that the Russians decided they would crack down on foreign automobile imports into Vladivostok. Okay, good. Makes economic sense. Going to encourage buying Russian products. It was the only business that Vladivostok had. They were getting cars from all over, used cars largely, and then reselling them. And so you had riots, and how did Moscow respond? It didn't trust local Oman to deal with it. It flew folks in from Moscow. Which to me is to suggest, we got a security problem we don't trust the locals to deal with.
But the Swedes achieved that with the Nazis in a sense, with, you know, shipping everything that the Nazis needed, or almost everything. I mean, with strict neutrality, wouldn't the Russians achieve the same kind of thing?
A strict neutrality would in fact imply that this is going to stay a local conflict. Do you believe a conflict between the United States